Well, good morning again, beloved. It's good to see you wide awake after getting woken up by the storms this morning, I'm sure. So glad you made it. We're taking a bit of a break this week from our series through Micah. It's the holiday weekend, and so just kind of don't want anybody to miss out as we walk through verse by verse in that book. And so we're going to dive back into the next psalm up as we take a decades-long journey through that book. We're now 3 years into it. In fact, we are 1/3 of the way through it today as we pick up Psalm 50. So take your copy of God's Word and turn there with me. Find halfway and then turn left. You'll get to Psalm 50, big number 50 in the book of Psalms. But here's what's funny, as we just pick up the next one that's up in these kind of off weeks like this, and it's really interesting that what we're going to see in, and we didn't plan it this way, but what Psalm 50 is going to show us is it's very much like Micah. The whole thing feels like it, sounds like it. There's a lot of the same kinds of themes. Like God's people had turned away, judgment was coming, and so we're going to see God's response to his people as they rebelled. And really what we're going to press into today is what true worship looks like. That's the whole theme of Psalm 50, and what God was addressing here is, what does true worship really look like? As we get into it today, though, this past Monday and Tuesday, Emily and I, my wife, got to attend a marriage retreat in Oklahoma City, and it's always good to get away, kind of a good time to just reconnect and spend focused time together, but more importantly, it does give us an opportunity to renew our relationship. Now, we're in a great place. We have always been, in our marriage, a great place because we put the work into it, by the way. It doesn't just happen. You have to, regularly scheduled maintenance on your car. You kind of need to just do some checkups along the way. But as we were there, I was thinking about my wedding ring. And we just had it, of course, right there on my finger, and we're just thinking about certain things. But really thinking about how this $100 stainless steel band, how this is a reminder of the covenant that we entered into over 17 years ago in our marriage. And how it daily reminds me, as I wear it right here, it just daily reminds me of the things that we committed to each other under God together. Well, that's essentially what God is going to do with Psalm 50. It's kind of like a spiritual marriage retreat with his bride, where there's this desire he has to renew the relationship, to refresh what's been missing. Something that, as he speaks about this true worship idea, he calls his people, he calls us, he calls them to this renewed relationship. That's what we're going to see here in Psalm 50, and we see it right away, verses 1 through 6, where God lays out this appeal to his people. It says, "The mighty one, God, the Lord, he speaks and summons the earth from the rising of the sun to its setting. Out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God shines forth. Our God comes, he does not keep silence. Before him is a devouring fire, around him a mighty tempest. He calls to the heavens above and to the earth that he may judge his people. Gather to me my faithful ones who made a covenant with me by sacrifice. The heavens declare his righteousness, for God himself is judge." We'll stop there for a moment. This first picture of God the author paints, it sure sounds a lot like Micah 1. Remember, we walked through the start of it and just the picture of God coming down from the mountain. This mighty God, it says, Yahweh, that he's showing himself to be visibly strong. He's the one over all, the transcendent one. He is God. But he calls to the whole earth here. And notice as he does that, he's inviting every person to listen to his words. He's inviting people to hear him. As he does that, though, notice it's not a blessing that he's bringing. It says he's coming, verse 6, as judge. Calls the whole earth. He's coming as judge. And Psalm 19:1 reminds us the same idea that the heavens declare his righteousness, that he's a worthy judge. He does all things right. That's the word justice. He does everything according to the rightness of it. In fact, the Hebrew word for righteousness here is tzedek, which is a word that means everything in its right order. So righteousness, justice in some ways as well, is everything as it should be. It's really what Deuteronomy 32 verse 4 describes about God. This is back in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. This is what Deuteronomy 32:4 describes about God. It says, the rock, not Dwayne Johnson, the rock, talking about God. His work is perfect. It's right, for all his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness without iniquity, just and upright is he. That's righteousness. That's God in himself as just and the judge. And so he calls the whole earth and says, hey, it's all coming in to hear me as I speak justice, I speak rightness. But notice he makes a distinction in verse 5. He says, gather to me my faithful ones, who made a covenant with me by sacrifice. So he's not talking about all people in this moment. He's talking about his people, those ones he has a special relationship with, and he's calling them out distinctly. Even as everybody gets to listen in, he calls them distinctly because something's out of order in their relationship. He wants to renew that relationship with his people. In other words, they might have the name faithful, but is it in name only? Are they truly the faithful ones of God? And so he's calling them back to renew that relationship. He's calling his people to himself and say, hey, let's spend some time together, let's talk. And listen, church, that's what he's doing for us every Sunday in here. As we gather to worship him like this, I pray that it's not just, as we'll see in a little bit, not just what you do because it's Sunday. Not just a ritual we go through to make it till lunch. He's summoning our hearts to a renewed relationship with him. It's kind of like a wedding ring, right? It's a reminder of what that covenant means of marriage between me and my wife. This is a reminder of what he's called us to and what he's done for us. And so it happens in here on Sundays, but remember, that's also a daily reminder, right? This is I don't just wear this on Sundays, right? I wear this every day, and God does that through his word, does that through his spirit. He's a daily calling us to be in renewed relationship. Believer, listen, you ought to feel God tugging on your heart regularly. Now, you should feel him convicting you of sin so you repent and renew the relationship. You should feel him drawing your heart to spend time with him intimately, regularly, quietly, so that you know his heart and you know that you're freely opening your heart to him. He should be pulling your heart towards him in that. If he's not, if you don't feel that, then you should be concerned. I mean, just think about it with, again, me and my wife. If I never talked to her, if I never spent time with her, never listened to her, we might still be married, doubtful, right? We might still be married, but there would be at least no relationship at all between the two of us. That's what God's doing. He's wanting us to renew the relationship together. He's calling us back to him to renew that. Okay, so how do we do that? He's called us. He says, here's what we're going to talk about, but how do we renew that? What's the heart issue that God is wanting to address in his people here in Psalm 50? Well, here's the first way we renew the relationship. It's through grateful worship. Through grateful worship. He's going to give us a couple more as we get into it, but grateful worship is the first one. Look at verses 7 through 15. We'll see this truth. It starts with almost a satirical reframing of the Shema in Deuteronomy 6. He said, "Hear, O people, Israel, I am your God. Here's what I want of you." He says something similar here, but it's almost kind of a satire over that. And notice as I read this, there's a condition to what he's talking about, verses 7 through 15. God says, "Hear, O my people, and I will speak. O Israel, I will testify against you. I am God, your God. Now here it is. Not for your sacrifices do I rebuke you. Your burnt offerings are continually before me. I will not accept a bull from your house or goats from your folds. For every beast on the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the hills, all that moves in the field is mine, God says. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and its fullness are mine. Do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats? No, basically he says instead, offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving. Perform your vows to the Most High. Call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me. Now, to get what he's saying here, you have to understand the sacrificial system and the way that God set up worship to be done at this time, right? There were laws that were happening all throughout the first 5 books of the Bible. You can go read those. There were laws for when and how people were to bring animals to sacrifice at the temple, mainly because they needed forgiveness, and this was the way God set it up to work. And the only way he would forgive was through the shedding of blood, because the penalty for sin is death, and so something had to die. Thankfully, it could be a substitute. Didn't have to be you every single time. It could be a substitute. But what they had to do is they had to keep bringing those animals to regularly cover their sins. So you got that side of the sacrifices. Then there were feasts and festivals. They would bring more animals and more animals. Like there was just a lot of blood. Can you imagine how much that was happening all day, every day? That's what God set it up to be. But notice in this passage that God's not referring in verse 8 to the actual practice of making those sacrifices, because he says you're doing it right. You actually get the logistics right, is what he says. You're doing the practice correctly. But here's why he was not accepting their sacrifices. Because they didn't care about their own spiritual condition. In fact, they were trying to manipulate God through the sacrifices. Like, we can do whatever we want. As long as we do these rules right, as long as we sacrifice right, God's going to be okay with us. Because apparently what this comes from is they had started to believe the narrative of other false religions around them that sacrifices met some kind of a need in that God, in their God. My wife and I went to India in 2007, and we saw it there, that there were shrines everywhere, hundreds upon hundreds in every corner of the city. And what people would do is they would bring food to these idols to feed that god. But the problem was, you walk around back and you see the caretaker of whatever shrine that is, and he's just taking baskets of that food and just dumping it in the alley. And monkeys and dogs and whatever else would come and eat it. And they believed that the God form would take on a dog or a monkey form and would eat it, and that's what it needed, was to be provided for. But if it's a true God, it doesn't need provisions, right? That's what he says here in verses 10 through 13. The true God doesn't need anything. He says, every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the hills, all that moves in the field is mine. It's like, I already got everything I need. I don't need anything from you. If I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you, because the world, like if I really did need to eat, which is a question that assumes no to that answer, right? If I did need to eat, I wouldn't tell you, because I already have everything I need. The world, its fullness are mine. Do I eat the flesh of bulls, drink the blood of goats? Like, I don't even eat like you do. So why are you trying to provide for me? It's the same thing the Apostle Paul said in Athens in Acts chapter 17. He says, verse 24, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. It's the same thing we saw in India, right? He's like, you don't need to feed God. He doesn't need anything. He, in fact, gives you everything you have. So what all this is saying, what God is saying to his people, is that you can't put me on a starvation diet to get what you want. give or not, just to get you in my stead here, in my debt. That's not how this works. He doesn't need anything from us. So what does he want from us? What did he want from them? Verse 14, offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving. You might say that differently. Make thanksgiving your sacrifice to God. Perform your vows to the Most High. Call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me. What he wants is grateful worship. Grateful worship. He doesn't want us to just go through the motions, to just do the rituals, to sing or to give without having the heart behind it. It's not what he wants. You can do all that. You can do it right. And he doesn't want it. He doesn't accept it because this is what he wants. He wants a living relationship with us, not just dead formalism where we go through all the things we're supposed to do because that's the way we grew up doing it. No, he wants a living relationship, and he's given us worship as an outlet for that, for us to express our gratitude to him. And notice here, it has nothing to do with style, with contemporary or traditional or whatever, any sort of style, because we should be able to worship God no matter the style. This is because this worship has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with our hearts, with gratitude, with thanksgiving, he says, as our sacrifice of worship and praise to God. Because Ephesians 5, 19 and 20 says, we are to sing and make melody to the Lord with your heart, giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Like singing is just giving thanks for everything to our God. That's the essence of worship, church. Which if we start thinking about it that way, that means it goes way beyond Sunday mornings, right? Like it's not just about what happens in here. It includes this, yes, that this is not just a formalistic ritual that we come together and we sing a few songs because that's what we do on Sundays. This is not just like an entertainment venue where you merely watch and then judge if you liked it or not. That's not what this is about. This is us singing praise out of thankfulness in our hearts to God. And because that's who he is, and because that's what he's done, then really, if our hearts are right, worship should explode in this room, right? Like if we know that we have nothing else but him, in the end, nothing else, then our thanksgiving should just pour out of our lives here. I remember hearing the story of believers in the underground church in China, where they travel hours just to meet together once a month, maybe, or once a quarter, just with few other believers that they know of, and they meet in different locations so they can't be tracked, and the whole process of that. They also, as they meet together, they can't even sing out loud, because if someone heard them singing out loud, they would get turned in and arrested. And so what they do is they just simply mouth the words of the praise songs. Maybe whispering, if anything. But they're just looking around at each other and they're all in unison singing these songs together without any noise coming out. And yet, as they do that, they're just weeping in gratitude for what God has done for them. They literally have nothing else, yet they're so thankful in their worship. Would you be willing to worship like that? Would you be willing to worship in a situation where you're at fear for your life, that you don't know who's coming through that door, you got a special knock to make sure they get in right, like all of that? Would you be willing to worship in a way that you're never going to be entertained by that? You're never going to enjoy preferentially one way or the other. You are just looking at each other knowing Jesus is all we have. Or would you jump ship real fast because this is just not enough for me? how to check our hearts in this, right? Here's another way to check your heart. Even as we gather together in this room like this regularly, is your heart unmoved as we sing and as we preach the gospel? Like, are you completely disengaged over what we're doing towards God? Are you more focused on preference or nostalgia than we are at responding to Jesus and what he's done for us? See, what we're trying to do here every week is we're trying to facilitate true worship. We're not just going through the motions. We're not just here to put on a show for other people. And I know there might be elements you don't prefer every week as we gather, but what you can address is your own heart. That's what you can control in your heart. What is my intent? Why am I here? What are we doing here? What am I supposed to be doing here? Because worship is not just to make you feel better. Worship is not just to impress other people around you, that they think better about you. You must remember, I must remember, it's so easy for me to go through the motions. I must remember that this is for the Lord. I'm responding to him in this. Again, though, yes, it has implications for what we do in here, but it also has implications beyond Sunday mornings, right? That really, when I say you are sent at the end of a worship gathering, worship never really ended. We don't end worship. You see what I mean by that, right? Worship never really ends. I mean, just listen to the way Romans 12, verse 1 says this. I appeal to you, therefore, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Your whole self is God's desired sacrifice now. Not animals, not just actions, your whole self. And what motivates that? He says, I appeal to you by the mercies of God. It's the mercy of God that you deserve God's judgment, and he gave you mercy instead, that God put the judgment you deserve on Jesus instead, that he's a sufficient substitute. His blood on that altar covers it all. You don't have to keep giving it. You don't have to keep bringing animals. You've got all of it covered. That's what motivates worship. Because again, worship is not just singing. It's what motivates worship in every corner as a living sacrifice. A spiritual worship to God is through this. And so just like I said, our praise in here should explode because of the mercy of God. We should live differently because of the mercy of God as well. Again, I keep going back. The image you should think today is marriage, wedding ring, renewing a relationship. Just like I want to sing the praises of my wife and live differently for her, is because she's loved me so well. And I look at that and I think, how else should I respond to that? Should I take advantage of that? Should take it for granted? No, I should change everything because I want to honor her. How much more true is that true in our relationship with God? She's an imperfect example of love, yes. God is not. He has loved us perfectly. That's why it says we should want to glorify him, right? The end of verse 15, I'll deliver you, you shall glorify me. That's what we should want to do as we sing in here, as we live out there. And the more you do it out there, the easier it is to do it in here. That fuels this. So worship is what God wants from us. Grateful worship. But along those lines, he's calling this renewal of a relationship in Psalm 50, but he raises another issue along those lines, this time directed at those who claimed his name but lived in opposition, lived otherwise. Continue on, look at verse 16 down through 22. But to the wicked, God says, Now, this is not wicked people out there. This is wicked people of his who are supposed to be the faithful ones, right? But to the wicked, God says, what right have you to recite my statutes or take my covenant on your lips? For you hate discipline, and you cast my words behind you. If you see a thief, you're pleased with him. You keep company with adulterers. You give your mouth free rein for evil. Your tongue frames deceit. You sit and speak against your brother. You slander your own mother's son. These things you have done, and I've been silent. You thought that I was one like yourself, but now I rebuke you and lay the charge before you. Mark this, then, you who forget God, lest I tear you apart and there be none to deliver. Again, this sounds a lot like Micah, right? That these supposed covenant people of God were taking the grace and mercy of God and stomping on it as if it were trash. That's why God calls them to renew the relationship here through sincere obedience. Grateful worship was part of it, that they should respond and do things in right-hearted ways, but then now sincere obedience is another way to renew that relationship. Because he says it here, that these people, these wicked ones, had God's commandments on their walls, had God's commandment in their history, but had none of God's commandments in their hearts. It's verse 17, you cast my words behind you. It would be like if I took this wedding ring and just tossed it. Forget it. It's what they're doing here. Because remember, in the covenant agreement God made with them at Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments, Moses comes off the mountain and says, here's the 10 rules to live by. Here's God's covenant with us. This is what he asked of us. Things like do not steal, do not commit adultery, do not lie. The basic ones, right? What were these people doing? They were encouraging stealing. They were hanging out with adulterers and just saying, no big deal. They were speaking evil, speaking lies, speaking slander against their own family. Just the exact opposite of what God said to do. And that's bad enough, of course, but just like we saw with Micah, these people didn't think God was going to do anything about it. He's gracious, right? He's kind, he's patient. That's who God is. That's his character. That's God. He's good. Gross miscalculation, right? Look at verses 21 and 22 again. God says to them, these things you have done, and I have been silent. You thought that I, which you can even phrase that in the original language, you thought that the I am, right, Yahweh, you thought that I was one like yourself. You thought that the I am, Yahweh, was just like you. But now I rebuke you, lay the charge before you. Mark this, you who forget God, lest I tear you apart, there be none to deliver. In other words, God is saying here, I made this covenant with you. I am God. There's a faithful response to that covenant, but what you're doing is not it. What you are doing, so-called faithful ones, is not being faithful, and so judgment was coming. Remember, church, Romans 2:4 says that we must not presume upon the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience. What that means is that when God gives us grace, it should lead us to repentance, to not take advantage of his mercy. So since for them and for us, God has not brought full judgment yet, what should our response be to him? Well, it's just like back in Micah, we saw, turn back to him in sincere obedience. If you're running astray one direction wrongly, he says, turn around and go the other way. Sincere obedience. It's the whole idea behind the word holy. We sing it, we talk about it. The word holy means that God has set apart his people to be distinct, to be different than the world around us, to show him off that we are his people. Which, by the way, is how Romans 12 continues. Verse 2, after this call to be a living sacrifice, verse 2 says then, do not be conformed to this world, to fall into the mold of the world around us. Don't be conformed, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. What that means is that sincere obedience we're talking about here, that God is calling us to, is a desire to follow God's will, to follow God's plan with every part of my life, every action, every thought, every inner response, every outer response. It's all saying, God, I want your will, not mine. I want your plan, not mine. You're in charge, not me. Sincere obedience is a desire to follow his will. It's what 1 Samuel 15:22 says. God says, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice. Meaning you can bring all of these animals you want. Obedience is more faithful to God. That's what he wants more than all of the rituals that we go through. But again, let me be clear about something. Notice the point here was not mere obedience. Because what can happen is that can get weird where we start to try to earn our salvation. We do it just because we have to or whatever, and you just say obedience and obedience. That's it. No, remember, God's calling us to sincere obedience. Because like we saw with worship, true worship comes from the heart. It comes from inside of you out to the rest of people and world and all of the external actions, right? It comes from inside first. Same with this. Obedience should come from the heart. It should come up from inside of you because you want to, because you're grateful for what God has done for you. That's what obedience comes. That's sincere obedience. And so just like with worship, it's not enough to fill the air with raised hands and swelling choruses if we're not concerned with truth and equity and justice. If we're not concerned about giving effort towards applying his word, to obeying God. Like if we're not doing that out there, he's looking at this. Like this is what Amos 5 says. God says this, take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps, I will not listen. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Saying you can come in here and raise your hands and sing, and we have the greatest music in the whole history of the church. We can do all of that. He said, but if you're not trying to live out the faith out there, I'm not even listening. Obedience is just as much worship. It's from the heart. Sincere obedience is worship too, because just like singing should be a grateful response to his grace, your obedience should be a grateful response to his grace too. And just think about it. How else should I respond to the one who lived the perfect life I couldn't live, who died the death I deserved, who defeated the enemy of sin and death I could never defeat on my own? How else should I respond to that? But that, church, is where it starts. That is where it starts. Because Psalm 50 ends this marriage retreat by saying you renew the relationship first and foremost through humble faith. Through humble faith. It's in verse 23. It's what grounds the rest of it. This is how he ends. He's just talked judgment. He's just said all the things. Verse 23, he says, the one who offers thanksgiving as his sacrifice glorifies me. To one who orders his way rightly, I will show the salvation of God. Again, this is not saying you can earn your salvation in any way. That's still a gift, yes, but remember the context. They were bringing sacrifices for the wrong reason. They were trying to manipulate God. They were bringing it as ritual. There was nothing in their heart that was driving it. It was not sincere in any way. That's why God says the one who glorifies him is the one who offers thanksgiving as a sacrifice. That's true worship, the one who comes with a grateful heart for all that God has done. That's the faith side of this equation. Right? You are saying, and you know in your heart, at the deepest part of who you are, that you are joyful over what God has done in your place. That you trust his work in your place. That's faith, right? That's trust in him in your place. That is core to all of this working as it should. But then he says this other phrase. He says, the one who orders his way rightly. It's the same word as righteousness back in verse 6, that God is righteousness. Now we order our way rightly. And so we now align our lives with God's right way. That's what he means by this. With God's path, with God's direction, we align our lives with it. So we got the faith piece. This here is the humble piece. Because to align your life with God's plan, you have to acknowledge that his plan is better than yours. That his plan is right and yours is often wrong. That you are acknowledging he's in charge. What he says goes. I submit to him and his ways, not try to make him submit to my ways. It's humble faith. But again, that's true worship, right? Where you are so grateful for his salvation that you die to yourself. That you allow him to direct your life. That you prioritize what he says to prioritize. That is true worship. And you do what Hebrews 13, verses 15 and 16 says, that in light of what Jesus has done, then through him, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Not just that we talk about him, but we acknowledge his name. It's the same with Proverbs 3. You give him the credit for what he is doing in your life. You follow him as your lead. That's acknowledging his name. And then verse 16 says, practically, do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. This is true worship. So how is God calling you back to him today? How does he want to renew that relationship with you? How does he want to get you to feel the blessed weight of that daily reminder? The wedding ring reminding of the covenant. How does he want to remind you of that feeling in your heart of the renewal of the relationship, the weight of the covenant, the joy it is to be in relationship? How does he want to renew that today? How does he want you to respond in grateful obedience, in grateful worship? How does he want you to respond in that? Remember, it starts with humble faith, church. It starts with the fact that he is God, your God, it says. He is God, your God, so listen to him. Fear him. Acknowledge his name. Give sacrifices of praise. Love him deeply for all that he's done for you, for all that he's done for us, for who he is. Just worship him. Let that drive everything about your life.